The title of my novel is Music for Three and a Prelude to Revolution. It's a coming-of-age story about Catherine Angelus, a piano protege who graduates from Juilliard in 1988 and finds herself at a crossroads about her future. Is she going to become a concert pianist or not? She takes a year off and goes to Prague, a city which her family fled after the 1948 communist coup d'etat. Catherine and her sister were raised on Bohemian and Moravian composers, of course, but also on the rich literature and art of the First Republic and the interwar avant-garde. So for Catherine, Prague is associated with that, not with fear and repression. She has a grant to study the original of a composition by Antonin Dvorak, one of her favorite composers. But within a week, she's translating reports on human rights violations, which are smuggled to the West. And in a little over a month, she's involved in a complicated love relationship. She also makes friends with several Eastern European women who are different in some ways very much from her. The novel follows these storylines from the autumn of 1988 through the summer of 1989 as covert resistance and also open protest continue to escalate. I lived in Prague during the period that Catherine lives there, and I also had a grant, but it was on theater rather than on music. And I got to know a whole subculture where people were resistant in covert ways to the communist regime. They were not dissidents. Dissidents were outcasts. They had regular jobs, but they found all kinds of ways to circumvent and subvert the ways in which the regime tried to control them. And it was just fascinating. It worked in different ways in different spheres. To take an example from something I saw in the theater world, and which is also in the novel, one small theater company received permission to stage the tragedy of Richard III by saying that they wanted to stage Shakespeare. The district committee who controlled all this sort of thing thought that was wonderful because classics tended to increase their prestige. But many of these people were uneducated, and in this particular case, they had no idea that Richard III was a tyrant who hacked his way to the throne of England. In many cases, audiences became used to reading between the lines in plays like this. And so such a play could mean for them the kind of tyranny that they were currently living under. It could also refer to the taboos of their history, such as the Stalinist trials of the 1950s, when hundreds of people were executed on trumped-up charges. Yes, very much. One of the things that any totalitarian society attempts to do, government attempts to do, is to isolate people. In communist Prague, you couldn't easily assemble on a street corner with too many other people. And one of the things that these small studio theaters did was to break down this kind of isolation. The same kinds of people came back to these performances again and again, and this created solidarity, and it began to create a network as well. People called these networks islands of freedom. In the novel, one of Catherine's best friends becomes an actress who works in these studio theaters, so we get an inside view of how this happened. Students learned to do this kind of thing in other ways, a lot of them through their school newspapers and other activities. These kinds of groups called themselves termites, eating out the rotting house of socialism. Prelude to Revolution has to do with the kind of resistance, covert resistance, which I've just been mentioning, and also escalating street protests in the time before the Velvet Revolution, which marked the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia. So from 1988 to the summer of 1989. Music for three has to do with a couple of things. It has to do, first of all, with Catherine's complicated love life. But music is also a metaphor in the novel, because it's the most fleeting of any of the arts, more so than, for example, literature or plastic art. We all need a certain amount of stability in ourselves, in our lives, in circumstances, in our relationships with other people, and yet things change all the time. And in a period like the one that Catherine lives through, they can change drastically. And this raises a lot of questions. The novel follows these events, but it also raises ethical and political questions about rapid change, and Catherine and other characters reflect on these changes. I hope they'll get to know a culture which is in some ways very different from ours, but which had particular strengths of its own. And I hope they'll feel empathy and admiration for the courage and tenacity of people who resisted totalitarianism without any hope of an immediate change. Some of these people were women who were exceptionally creative or had tremendous personal and political courage, and both. And there were women among them who really deserved to be known outside of their own culture.